I'm going to continue my look at the Develop module today, continuing from where I left off and working on the split toning, detail, lens corrections, effect, and camera calibration panels. So I'll jump right in with split toning, and you can work on this in two ways, in color or in black and white, and achieve different effects. For example, I can use split toning in color to warm up cold looking shadow areas. And we got in the background here these darker areas, they're a little bit blue. So I think what I'll try to do is warm those up just a little bit. What I found, and borrowed this from the Luminous Landscape where Michael Reichman uses it, is a color value of 50, which is 50 degrees on the hue, is a nice warm tan color. I can also pick colors by clicking here and grabbing what I need to use. But 50 seems to work pretty well. Now that's highlights. I'm also going to put in 50 for the shadows. And if I start pulling up saturation on the shadows, I start seeing that those darker areas, which are basically midtones, but it's close, those start warming up. It can be subtle. If I go too far, it becomes obviously too much. But zeroed out versus about 10. Just enough to warm those up. And oftentimes that helps add a little bit extra to the photo. Now if I go to extremes, take a look at how the balance affects this. If I go balance toward the shadows or toward the highlights. Let's choose a blue there and see how that switches. So it becomes pretty obvious what happens if you balance toward shadows or highlights. And if I balance in the middle, I get this kind of alien looking landscape. Oftentimes what I might do is go 50 there, and it was about 250 on the blues, maybe 240. And that gets to be an interesting look with blue, even bluer shadows and warm highlights, and then season that to taste and adjust the amounts. Oftentimes lower saturation values are going to be more effective because when you max everything out, it looks a little bit too cartoonish. But it may be appropriate for the particular photo you're working on. So that's working in color. Now if I switch this to black and white and I zero the saturation out first and zero out my balance. Now if I switch this to black and white, I can start playing with, close that again, so I'm working black and white, and now I can play with antique looks, sepia tone, selenium, what have you, trying to approximate those traditional darkroom processes. You can also find some of them under the black and white toned presets in Lightroom, antique, and so forth. I'm going to leave those alone for now and sort of roll my own. Now simply bringing up highlights and shadows just a little bit. Make sure that's back at 50 because I'm working just in warm tones right now for this. Just playing around with trying to create kind of an antique look. Not terribly high on the slider values, 20 and 30. And it gives a nice warm look to the photo. And I can further balance that. And there, up about 50 on the balance slider. Just a hint now of saturation in the shadows and leaning more towards saturation in the highlights. And that's a nice subtle look, and I think I prefer that to going over the top. If I go over the top, well, then it starts to look a bit much. If I go back in history, that's a nice subtle look there. In fact, I think I'm going to save that as a snapshot. I'll call that antique. So I'm going to leave that there, black and white with a split toning applied, and move into detail. Now detail is pretty important here. You've got your sharpening and noise reduction settings. Noise reduction, I'm going to deal with that in a separate image. But I want to take a look at sharpening. Now a few notes about sharpening. What I'm working on here is called input sharpening, which is a starting point, and it's an important starting point. But there's a second sharpening step called output sharpening, which would be applied when I'm ready to output the image, whether it's to a print, to the screen at a certain size, wherever it's going, I have a second step for sharpening. But I need to get the photo started with the input sharpening. And the reason for this is the photo comes out of the camera lacking some of the sharpness that it can have because of uh, lens softness, the filter in front of the camera sensor, any number of reasons. There's detail there, but it's not quite visible, and input sharpening helps bring that detail out. When I'm sharpening, I don't necessarily want to be in this zoomed out view. There's no good reason for it because I can't tell what's going on when I sharpen. So I click 1:1, which is 100%. It could also work at 2:1 or 200%, but 1:1 is a good balance. I'm going to hide this side panel, give myself a little bit more room to see. I could use this thumbnail view, and if I right click on it, I can switch that to a 200% view. But it's just a little bit too small for my liking. So I'm going to use this larger zoomed in view. And this area right here has a good example of the types of detail you're going to encounter. Precise, high frequency detail in the bark of the tree here, the sparkles on the snow, and low frequency detail. The field of snow itself has very little detail, and we start to see some areas where there's a mix of the two. And we've got dark and light edges, high contrast edges, which is what sharpening works on, edges, bringing out those edges and making them more apparent. So I can really get a good idea of what's going on as I sharpen this photo. These are the default settings in Lightroom for sharpening. They're relative to each camera, but the numbers are the same no matter what camera you bring in, as long as you haven't adjusted the defaults. And before I end this video, I'm going to talk about setting defaults, but that'll be at the end. So 25 amount is how much sharpening overall. Radius is how apparent is the sharpening, how big is the edge radius going to be. Detail is a combination of adjusting that edge radius or applying an extra set of sharpening algorithms. And masking is, am I showing sharpening on this portion of the image or am I hiding it on this portion? So, we'll go through from top to bottom. Now, I can access a second view for each of these sliders if I hold the Option or Alt key and click the slider. If I hold Option, and I'm on a Mac so it's Option, if I'm on Windows it would be the Alt key. If I hold that button, that key, and then click and hold on the slider, the photo switches to a black and white view because the sharpening is only being applied on the luminance information for the photo. It's not being applied to the color. And then if I continue holding Option and then drag this up and down, I can go through the range from 0 to 150%. And once I'm above 100%, it's really in this, it's not effective. It's too much. Generally, I'm around 20, 30, maybe 40% for sharpening. Try about 40 for this. All right. Now Option again, and click and hold on the radius slider, and it switches to an edge detection view. If I go down to 0.5 pixels, I see that I'm not applying a large radius to this. If I go up to 3 pixels, it becomes pretty apparent. And I see halos around the edges. Now, some haloing is okay, but this is really going to be too much for this photo, and 3 is a very high value. You'll very seldom use that. For portraiture, you may be around a value above 1 pixel radius, 1.4, maybe 1.5, something like that. For a high-frequency photo like this, and the high-frequency detail is what I'm really interested in with this photo, I want to be down generally at 1 pixel or lower. And I'd say about 0.7 or 0.8 is a good place for this level of sharpening. So I'll release those buttons and then head down to detail. Now at the low end, detail will try to eliminate some of that haloing we just saw on radius. So if I hold Option and click on the detail slider, I see I don't have a lot of haloing. I push this up and I'm starting to see more at the upper end. And if I zero that out, the haloing almost disappears. So for low frequency images, a low detail setting would be appropriate, generally speaking. For high frequency detail, and that's again what I'm interested here, I want to go up to a higher detail setting, generally above 25. About 50, I think, is working pretty well. Finally, I'm ready to adjust masking. And what masking does is more edge detection, finding the solid smooth areas versus the detailed areas. Because there's really no reason to apply sharpening to this broad, clean expanse of snow. It may bring out some detail. It may bring out extraneous detail that starts to look like grain or noise. It's not really necessary. So if I hold Option and click on the slider, right now sharpening is being applied everywhere. But as I pull this up, I start to see black areas. And where it's black, the sharpening is disabled. And then the gray areas means that some sharpening is getting through. If I go all the way up, I'm really only sharpening the edges, and probably not very much. So I want to find a mix here because I definitely want to make sure that my sharpening is applied to those detailed areas, but not as much to the smooth areas of snow or sky. About 15, maybe 20 is a good place for this photo. I'll go about 17 for that. Alright, so if I take a look, bring back my history, and go back to before I started sharpening, and we see the photo gets a little bit softer. It was already in focus, and I didn't have many problems going with the sensor and lens combination. But adding that input sharpening brings just a little bit more acuity to the photo, and it's ready to go. So, ready to look at noise reduction. I'm going to look at that in another photo. Since this is ISO 100, it's already pretty clean, so I'm going to leave noise reduction alone for it. Let's take a look at this, which is shot at ISO 3200 on a D2X, and that is a very, very noisy photo. It's also underexposed quite a bit. So I'll take this into Develop and bring the exposure up before I do anything else. So even at this zoomed out view, the noise is very apparent. The D2X does not handle high ISOs well at all. So it's a good example to see just what we can do with noise. There's really no way to make this a clean photo, but I can reduce the noise to some extent. So if I go and zoom in to 100%, it's sandpaper. This is a worst case scenario. I'm going to zero out sharpening because what that's doing right now is just accentuating the grain, or the noise I should say. Grain is for film. The defaults for noise reduction are 0 for luminance and 25 for color. Now before I move on, let me talk about what that means. Luminance is black and white noise. It doesn't really have a color value. It's what we would consider to be film grain. But color noise, or chroma noise, has a color to it. Now if I zero out this slider, we start to see this rainbow pattern appear. That's color noise. And the nice thing is color noise is very visible when it's there, but it's easier to get rid of than luminance noise. Even something like 10% starts to get rid of that color noise. Now for something at ISO 800 or 400, where there's still some color noise, 10% will get rid of it. On this ridiculously underexposed, ridiculously high ISO image, even 10% is not enough, and that 25 setting is getting a lot closer. Be careful going too high on color noise reduction because it'll start smearing colors that are supposed to be color. Like red tones will start to get smeared and blurred. So 100% color noise reduction, generally not necessary. But 10, 20, 25 may be appropriate. Depends on the photo. Now, having done that, I can move on to the luminance noise reduction. And I want to say that some noise is okay. Trying to reduce the noise 100% leads to a plastic look, and it's unnatural. We're used to seeing noise. You know, we've got centuries worth of film photography that had its grain structure, and a little grain is not a bad thing. For most photos with grain, or with noise, 10% setting is a good starting point. In this photo, of course, it's gone no matter what. So 25, now I'm starting to hide that noise. And I'm still retaining some detail along the edges. So it's a balance point. How far up do I want to go with noise reduction? How much detail do I want to destroy? Because going up here, I've lost detail. I know that those edges are fairly sharp in reality. So maybe 40% in this case is a good compromise. The noise is there, there's no way around it, but I still have my edge details here. I'm going to leave these sliders alone for now because it's really farther than I want to get in on this demo. But that's a good start for luminance noise reduction and color noise reduction. So going back to the photo I've been working on, and I just want to make sure here, yeah, 25 in color, that's a bit much because I know that at ISO 100 this doesn't really have a problem with color noise. So I'm going to set that to 5. And just in case there is any underlying color noise to zero that out. So 5 for that, but then 0 for luminance noise reduction because I don't want to soften any of the photo. There's probably a little bit of noise floating around in here, but we can see some in the shadow areas, but it's so subtle that I'd rather keep all the detail I can rather than even putting in 10 points of noise reduction. So I'll zoom back out and collapse this panel. Now I'm ready for lens corrections. So no lens is really perfect. It's always going to have some sort of distortion and vignetting. Better lenses will have less of that, but generally there's at least some. And what we have in Lightroom and Camera Raw is a way to clean up some of that distortion. Now this particular lens I'm using, it's not been automatically detected. Even if I turn on profile corrections, it's still not recognized. But I do know that the lens is in the database. And Lightroom has a pretty good sized database of lenses. If you have the Canon and Nikon kit lenses, the 18 to 55 millimeter lenses, those are all in the lens database. In this case, I'm using a Tokina 12 to 24 millimeter f4 lens, and it is this one right here. And I'm going to use the Nikon profile since I'm on a Nikon camera. In this case, it's pretty subtle. If I switch that off, I see a little bit of adjustment in the corners with the distortion and the vignetting. And the vignetting is darkening toward the edges. So it's not a huge thing, but I'm going to leave that on just to make sure I'm applying that as well. I can fine-tune the amount of distortion and vignetting adjustments. If I zero distortion out, it will reset to essentially what it was without the profile. And if I put that to 200, it exaggerates the correction. Generally, I will either stay at 100 or drop it to 0. But in this case, I'll stay at 100. Same with vignetting. Turn off the correction, accentuate the correction. I'll leave that at 100 as well. Now, I'm going to move into color, and chromatic aberration is another nice feature. Before I adjust that, I'm going to switch this back to the color because it'll be easier to see the correction. Then close that panel. Now what chromatic aberration is, and there are two types, but I'm not going to get into that in detail. It's a color shift along edges, and it's most visible at the corners of the frame. We see this yellow patterning here along these edges, and then there's some purple and yellow along these. In the past, we had to manually adjust sliders, but Adobe has gotten the workflow automated enough and good enough that just checking this option will take care of most of the chromatic aberration, and it's disappeared. If I go back in history, see the yellow there, and then gone. I'm going to leave defringe alone again for this. I'm going to leave it for another demo. But checking remove chromatic aberration is a good idea. Even the best lenses will still have a little bit of it. And in this case, this lens, it's got a decent amount of chromatic aberration. So being able to remove that, it's one more way to increase the quality of the photo. So when I print this, if I print it large, those colors won't be there. Now I move down to effects, and here's where I can apply some artistic effects. I've removed vignetting, but maybe I want to add some back, and I want to control what it looks like. I can use that with post-crop vignetting. Now, post-crop vignetting simply means that no matter how I crop this photo, that vignetting will be applied to the final cropped image. So let me switch this to an 8:10 crop. The amount in the negatives adds a vignette. In the positives, lightens the corners. So I'll go to -100, which once again is over the top. Midpoint controls how far in the effect goes, or out toward the edges. So that's kind of nice there. Roundness is the shape of the vignette. And then feathering is how rough or smooth the vignette is. So you can create one of these old-timey effects. And then highlights, it adjusts how those corners get affected and how the image gets to show through the corners. I can also adjust the style. Paint overlay is kind of a brute force style. Highlight is the default, and I think that works pretty well, but occasionally I may need to use color, which just is a different way of adjusting the pixels there. But if that's all Greek there, I'd say stick with highlight priority, and it'll be safe. Experiment if you will. So for a more natural looking vignette, what I think I'm going to do is definitely not -100, but just a little bit of a darkening. I think I'll try color priority for this. I like what the effect does in the sky up there. Okay, so there's vignetting. Now, we've been through sharpening and the possibility of noise reduction. It may be that I'd want to add some grain for a certain effect, or just to add the appearance of sharpness, because adding a little bit of grain can make the photo look sharper. I'm going to zoom into 100% again for this and take a look at my smooth areas and detailed areas. So the amount, how sandy do you want the photo to look? The size, how big is it pebble sized or dust sized? Kind of a pointillism effect at the low end. And the roughness, this is a more regular look, and this is a more random look. So personally, I'd say a higher roughness would work for this. Large size gets a little bit too blurry. Small size is too small, but what about in the middle there? That's not too bad. Now, the amount was way too high, so I'm going to go down, decrease my size of the grain. So it's a different effect, kind of an antique look, once again, and it would look pretty good with my black and white split tone. I'm going to lower that value a little bit more. Now, the nice thing is, the grain is relative to the size of the photo. So I apply it at this full-size raw image. When I output it, the grain is recalculated to try and look pleasing at whatever the output size is. So if I output this to 800 pixels web image, the grain will still be visible. Even though an 800 pixel image is about this size, the grain would still be kind of looking like this. So I can know that Lightroom will make sure that the grain effect I've chosen will be visible no matter what my output is. Alright, now the last step here is camera calibration, and this is something that you don't really change image to image. It's a setup step. It's something you want to just have in place and then not worry about. What I can control here is the process version, and we currently have 3 process versions available in Lightroom and Camera Raw. 2003 dates back to when Camera Raw was first introduced, and 2010 was an extension of that, and then 2012 is what Lightroom 4 uses, along with, I think it's Camera Raw 7, I can't remember for sure. If I switch to process version 2010, a warning sign appears, and then the image look changes. And a few other things change in the controls. The basic panel looks different. It has different controls and ways of manipulating the photo. In my opinion, compared to what you get in process version 2012, this is not the most optimal way to work on a photo. But I have photos from the past few years that do use this, and it may be appropriate to stay in 2010 if I revisit those photos, because to get optimal results I would have to rework the image almost from scratch, switching to process version 2012. So this is of interest, but I'd recommend stay in 2012 if you can, unless the photo dictates that 2010 or 2003 is more appropriate. The profile is the overall look of the photo, an overall tone curve and color adjustment, independent of the tone curves and color adjustments we make in the other panels. The default is Adobe Standard. It does a pretty good job. You also have modes that depend on what camera was used to shoot the photo, and this is what we see if it's a D2X photo. A D7000 photo would have different options, a Canon 5D would have different options, and so on. But what these correspond to is different modes that the camera has available. So the D2X has these different presets for its color rendering, and then 3 color rendering modes. My personal preference is camera neutral, which is a flatter starting point. Camera vivid, obviously higher contrast. This is one of those things where you may just want to stick with Adobe Standard, or you may want to experiment with a variety of photos and see which one of these presets would work, and then lock that in and don't worry about it. So for my settings, it's camera neutral, but let's say it's just Adobe Standard. So set it, forget it. The other controls here have to do with profiling the camera to a certain standard that may be appropriate for you. I'm not going to go into that, but it's there. It essentially involves working with a color checker, but that's not important, at least for this demo. So before I end this, I want to take a look at building a default setting for Camera Raw in Lightroom. Now it's up here under Develop and Set Default Settings. Now this is one of those things I don't want to do quite yet because I've applied a whole bunch of changes to this photo. Tone, detail, color settings, a whole bunch. And if I say Update, every photo is going to look like this. An antique photo with a vignette and a specific set of sharpening settings. So I don't want to do that quite yet. I'm going to take a photo that I haven't done anything to yet and take a look at what I might change for my defaults. Now one thing to note before I go further is you have some options for how defaults work in Lightroom. If I go into Lightroom Preferences and Presets, I see here Make Defaults Specific to Camera Serial Number and Camera ISO Setting. So if I'm working with, say, 3 cameras that are the same model, but I know that they have slightly different looks, I can do specific defaults for those individual cameras to try and make them look the same or different for some reason. That one I generally leave alone. But what I do like is making defaults specific to camera ISO setting, because I know that ISO 100 has a different look than ISO 1600. 1600 is going to be a bit noisier. So I may want to apply different sharpening and noise reduction settings to those ISOs. So I check this, and now when I make defaults, it'll be specific to that ISO, in this case ISO 100 for this photo. So what I do is go down through the tabs, through the panels, and make sure everything is zeroed out to start with. In tone curve, I want that to be flat and linear. No HSL adjustments, and it's going to stay in color. Oh, close that. Split toning. Personally, I like to set my 50 and 50 with no saturation. That way I don't have to keep typing that in. And again, this is happily borrowed from the luminous landscape because I agree it's a nice color to use. So just because occasionally I like to warm up shadows and do some toning work. So I've found also that 50 for that color works. So I want to make sure that stays. For detail, my preference is to leave sharpening turned off. It makes processing the image a little bit faster when I'm working in the upper panels. And I know that I want to apply specific individual sharpening settings per image. The same with luminance noise reduction. I want that to stay turned off on a so I can adjust on a per image basis. Color I want to leave on, but I want it to be more controlled. I know that ISO 100 is very clean on this camera, and 25 for color it's higher than it needs to be. So I'm going to set 5, and that will be my default color noise reduction for ISO 100 on the D2X. Lens corrections, I want to make sure I remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections, even though it's saying none right now because it's not automatically recognizing that particular lens, but I do want to make sure that it's turned on. Under effects, no vignetting, no grain. And for calibration, I want to make sure I'm in 2012 process version and my personal preference of camera neutral. So with that, I have a starting point established on what my default develop settings are for this photo, for all ISO 100 photos on the D2X. Go up to Develop, Set Default Settings, D2X, ISO 100, Update. Now, any new photos that I bring in will have these defaults applied to them. It doesn't change what I've done to this one, which is also ISO 100, and it doesn't change this one, which was ISO 3200. And just for fun, I'm going to set defaults on this. First, I'm going to reset it, turn off all the adjustments I made. So I know basic is zeroed out, tone curve is zeroed, HSL zeroed, split toning. I do want to put my 50s in again. Turn sharpening off, luminance noise reduction. I'm going to turn that on to 10 just because I know it's a ISO 3200 is not clean at all. And then 25, I'm going to put that up to 30% for color, just a bit higher. Turn that off, or close that I should say, not turn it off. Enable profile corrections. This was a manual focus 50mm lens and there's no profile for it, so that defaults to none. But I do want it turned on for other ISO 3200 photos that might have a lens that is in the database. And remove chromatic aberration. Effects off, calibration to camera neutral, and now I'm ready to build that default setting. This is a time-consuming process when you're starting out until you've gotten all of the ISOs defaulted. But once it's in place, you're working in a more consistent manner. So just having these two made, ISO 3200 and ISO 100, and knowing that one set of images has a certain noise reduction versus another noise reduction for other images, it's helpful to have that. With that, we've been through our developed settings from basic to camera calibration and setting defaults. So that should be about it for develop. Hope it's been helpful.